Okay. I thought maybe my dog would be giving this lecture video, but I don't think he's up to it. So um, this is going to be hopefully 15 to 20 minutes max, just about the final paper. Um, so I've given you three documents so far: a final paper prompt, which sort of describes, which not just sort of, but actually does describe what it is I want from the final paper, a rubric, which shows you kind of what I'm going to be looking for in a way that should be helpful to you, so you can kind of keep track of the requirements and if you have those in your paper. And then a suggested format. Now, if you've already started your paper or maybe you finished your paper, don't worry, you don't have to start over, but this should help you to make sure that you can get as good a grade as possible. Okay, so let's start with the prompt. So basically, you're going to be putting on the anthropologist hat, and you're going to be describing a culture, but that culture is going to be U.S. culture. Now, obviously, there's multiple cultures also within the U.S., so you can define that however you want, but maybe be specific about it so that when I'm grading it, I know what it is that you're talking about. Obviously, there's going to be different ways that different people are going to describe the culture of the U.S. I mean, it's a country of 320 million plus people, so just try to be as specific as possible with regard to what you're talking about. Obviously, oh, hey, buddy. You are from this culture or are familiar with it, so it might make it more difficult, but that's kind of the idea. We have studied like key anthropological concepts that are useful for all cultures throughout the world, but a harder thing than looking in at some other culture is to sort of look at your own from the outside. And that's kind of like what I want this culminating exercise to be. I want it to be you looking critically at our own culture. So for this paper, what I want you to do is I want you to pretend that you are from the society, the Tibetan society that's described in When Brothers Share a Wife. Okay? Now, obviously, like that article, it's a pretty short article. It doesn't give you like a full, complete description of that culture, but you can sort of interpolate, just kind of go with what they present from that culture. So imagine you're from there. Now, like, let's be real. This is in the 21st century. I mean, that article was written in the 20th century, at the end of the 20th century, not that long ago, but there are very few people throughout the world that know nothing about the United States. However, if you are in a place that's a bit more isolated in terms of media or what's coming through via internet, depending on even if you have reliable internet access, you're only going to see bits and pieces. And that obviously doesn't make you an expert in some other culture. It would be like trying to watch Bollywood movies and thinking you're an expert in the culture of India. Obviously, there are many, many, many cultures within India, and then there's sort of, you might be able to draw broad lines about some kind of, pan-Indian aspects, but watching these movies isn't going to give you a full picture. So imagine you're someone who may have a small understanding of the U.S., but then you go to the U.S. as an anthropologist from this Tibetan society described in When Brothers Share a Wife, and you spend 1 to 2 years here doing participant observation. So that's where you're coming from in this. Now, what I want you to do, so don't, try not to make it like a caricature of like, someone from a exotic, primitive society that doesn't know what a cell phone is. I mean, because that's just not realistic. The point is to look at us from the outside. But in order to do that, I give you a point of reference, and that point of reference is the society described in this article, which you should have read. If you haven't read it at this point, go and read it. It's only like 4 or 5 pages, and it's on Canvas. What I want you to focus on, I want you to pick 3 of the anthropological concepts that I have listed. So, kinship systems, marriage, economic systems, political systems, gender, ethnicity, and race or religion. Obviously, the article When Brothers Share a Wife doesn't go into great detail about all of those things. So, for some of those, you may have to do just a little bit of background research. This is not supposed to be a research paper. The research is not the important part. The important part is applying anthropological concepts to our own society. So When Brothers Share a Wife obviously is mainly about marriage, but it's also about economic systems and political systems to some extent. And there's gender in there. There's a little bit of religion. There's not so much about race, kind of ethnicity, but you could extrapolate. You can imagine that if you're living in this Tibetan society, the idea of race is not a pervasive one, probably. Now, I could be wrong because I'm not an expert in Tibetan society, let alone the specific version of Tibetan society discussed in this article. But pick 3 of those things, and you are going to look at those aspects of life in the United States. So first of all, you need to, at some point, and I'll get into this a little later, but at some point you need to describe, like, well, what do you mean by gender, or what do you mean by economic systems? And then I want you to describe how those operate here in the United States. So, if you're talking about marriage, what does the practice of marriage look like in the United States? How is it viewed? Why do people get married? What kinds of marriages are considered legitimate? What are the majority of marriages? What are certain minorities of marriages? So I want you to describe that, how that's done in the United States, okay? Then, and this is the thing that I think, if you're just reading these documents that I posted, you might have some questions about. I want you to try, as an anthropologist, to explain why they take the form they do in the United States. So if you read When Brothers Share a Wife, you should have gotten the point that there's an explanation of why fraternal polyandry makes sense in Tibetan society. In that particular Tibetan society. Now, when I say analyze it based on a functionalist approach, what I mean is, what function does that particular form of marriage serve in that society? Now, please don't use this video as your only point of reference for this article. You should have read the article. So if you haven't, definitely read the article. But in the article, it describes how fraternal polyandry makes a lot of sense in that society because of the ecology and because of the political economy. So because of the relatively sparse amount of arable land, like land that can be used for agriculture, and because of the way that families with land, which are not all families, pass on that land. So that's a functionalist approach. A functionalist approach assumes that most cultural practices have a logical reason for why they work and why they continue within a particular society. Okay? Now, a historical approach will look at a sequence of events of why something is the way it is. So, for example, now I'm not talking about Tibetan society here, but if you look at like European societies, and certain countries are Catholic and certain countries are Protestant, and obviously there are other religions present as well, but like if you want to talk about a Judeo-Christian perspective in a given European society, you might say, well, that exists because politically, back in the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, these early states that were forming in parts of Europe decided to align themselves with the Holy Roman Empire. And so they adopted Christianity because that was the religion of that empire at the time. And that spread, and so now they have these Judeo-Christian values, right? And then, there was the Protestant Reformation that took place in what's now Germany, and and then it spread to other places, blah, 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 blah. So there's a whole historical reason why things happen the way they happen. If you're talking about race in the United States, the reason that we have seen race as we have over the last century or two has to do with all the things we talked about in the second half of the class, about slavery and capitalism, about the Industrial Revolution, about colonialism, right? And so now we're left with this legacy of viewing people in categories that don't really exist as discrete biological categories, but exist as social categories because of our history, okay? Obviously, this is a 3-page paper, so you can only go into so much detail on these things, but the point that I am trying to get across with this assignment is that although one culture is different from another culture, the reason that things are the way they are can be discovered through certain types of analyses, looking at functionalist approaches, looking at historical approaches. There's multiple approaches within anthropology, but those are the two that I want you to focus on. You don't necessarily have to discuss both for each of your concepts. Use whatever you find to be most explanatory, okay? So again, don't freak out about this. I'm just asking you to talk about how are these things experienced in the United States, marriage or gender or race, and why? Why, right? It's not random. It's not completely random. There are reasons why, okay? So anthropology is a social science, and science tries to answer the question, why? Okay? So that's what I mean by explain why, based on a functionalist and should be or historical approach, okay? And then I also would like you to briefly just compare them to your own society. And when I say your own, I mean here Tibetan society. Well, okay? I mean the society described in When Brothers Share a Wife, okay? That's basically the paper, but within that, I would also like you to make some reference to the definition and characteristics of culture, which was in one of our early lectures, okay? What is culture? That tells you something about how culture comes about. So that will be helpful in explaining how cultural practices get passed on. I would also like you to describe how cultural relativism, how come my pen's not working? Cultural relativism is used and why it's important. Why, like how as this pretend Tibetan anthropologist, how are you using cultural relativism to try and understand the United States, okay? Okay, let's move on to the rubric. The main thing I want to go over here is the grading breakdown. So I'm basically giving you half the points for doing the assignment as it's assigned. Like the way that I ask you to do it, all the things that I ask of you, do you do that all? If you do all of that, you get half the credit, right? So that's content here, okay? Content, the inclusion of all the requirements. That gives you 50% of your grade right there. Make sure you do everything that I ask, everything that we just talked about, okay? Now, so you can almost pass this, get a passing grade on this just by doing it, almost. Okay, but to make sure that no one's slacking off completely, right? If you want to get a better grade than a D minus, you need to focus on the other things. The second most important thing is the analysis and a demonstration that you understand these anthropological concepts, okay? That's 40% of your grade. That's another 20 points. This is out of 50, okay? So how well you convey, if you choose marriage, define, how anthropologists talk about marriage, what are the roles of marriage, blah, 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 and how well you attempt to analyze that from a functionalist and or historical approach in the U.S. All right. And then the last part is clarity and effectiveness of communication. And obviously, this is a huge class. I don't have enough time to go into what makes excellent writing and all that. So I've made this the smallest part of the grade. But in college, you should try to make a cogent argument, something that flows logically. Spell check the heck out of it. That's easy. That should be done automatically. Complete sentences, not run-on sentences. Do your best writing. Someone asked me if this has to be very formal. It doesn't have to be robotically formal. This isn't a chemistry paper, but try not to use conjunctions or words with apostrophes, like don't, didn't, won't. The language should be a little bit more formal. But because you are speaking as a person, as an anthropologist, if you use I statements, that's okay. Maybe try not to make the entire paper a bunch of I statements, but you can use that. But try not to use super colloquial or conversational phrases. You're writing a paper, you're not talking to a friend, okay? I hope that makes sense. Okay? And then the rest of this is just for you, a checklist for content. Does it have an intro, body, and conclusion, which I'll get to in a second? Does it cover the 3 clearly stated anthropological concepts that you've chosen? Is the form and practice of each concept in the U.S. described clearly? Yada, yada, yada. Okay, you can go through this on your own. It shouldn't require that much explanation. And then, suggested format. I would strongly suggest that you follow this fairly closely. You can rearrange certain things if you don't find this the most natural way to go about it. But only do that if you're sure that you can really address everything in a way that makes sense. Okay, so basically, here's what I have. Again, this is a 3-page paper, so I'm giving you some guidelines here. So you have an introduction. You have an introduction, you have a conclusion, and in the middle you have the meat of the paper. Okay, so your introduction should be 1 paragraph. Here's something that I didn't write explicitly in here, but for your first page, you don't need a cover page. If you're really into that and you really want to do it, go for it. You don't need one. You should have your name on there, your full name. You don't really need much else. I know what class it is. So please don't take up half the page writing your name, Anthropology 101, the date, the name of your paper, blah, 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 blah. You've only got 3 pages. Okay, so don't make a huge heading. So your introduction should be about 1 paragraph. This can go a number of ways. I'm just suggesting some things here. Discuss mention what are the topics you're going to be discussing. What are the three main concepts you're going to be looking at? Say something in a narrative form about how you're an anthropologist from the Himalaya region, blah blah blah. And maybe this is a good place to say something about how you're going to use cultural relativism, okay? How that's going to allow you to not so subjectively view the United States. You're not judging it, you're trying to understand it, right? Okay, so that should be simple. The body, I'm saying here about 2 paragraphs per anthropological concept. You could have one, this should obviously take up the majority of your paper. So about 2 paragraphs per concept. So there's 3 concepts, 3 times 2 is 6, around 6 paragraphs total for this. But I'm not going to be counting the paragraphs. I'm going to be looking at the structure. If it's a run-on paragraph and there's a clear, it should have a break in there somewhere, that might be something I'll look at, but that goes to clarity of writing, and that's a small amount of points. So don't stress out about that too much. Just try to make it logical and make it flow. So for each of these concepts, I want you to do the following. Briefly explain what the concept is and how anthropologists understand it, like gender or kinship. What does kinship mean to anthropologists? What do anthropologists say the general function of kinship is? Describe how it's practiced or understood in the United States, right? So if you're talking about kinship, how do we define our kinship relations, generally speaking? Is it patrilineal? Is it matrilineal? Is it cognatic, where we trace our descent through both sides? What about living situations? When you get married, do you live with the husband's family? Do you live with the wife's family? Do you go off and have your own home for your new family that you're starting? And again, this could vary depending on the specific segment of society you're talking about. If you're talking about marriage, how is marriage viewed? First of all, you should realize that it is defined in different ways. Like there's a religious way to define marriage. There's a legal way to define marriage. What are acceptable legal marriages? That's something kind of interesting about the United States. That might not be true. My dog just farted, by the way. That might not be true of everywhere else. And then I would like you to do your offering an explanation of why it's practiced or understood in that way, looking at the historical circumstances and or functional circumstances, right? Why is marriage practiced the way it is here? You could look at that a couple of different ways. You could look at it functionally, and that may have something to do, for example, with economics. Or you could look at it historically. Think about the history of this country. Think about the roots of the philosophies and religions that are predominant in the country, right? Now, and then this might be a good place to also compare how it's understood or practiced in your Tibetan society versus how it's practiced here, okay? So you want to do that for each of your concepts. And then a conclusion. So in your conclusion, I suggest, this might be a good place to talk about how the definition and or characteristics of culture that we talked about early on in the semester, how those help to explain how these different practices are passed down, right? It's not like there's some puppet master that's saying you have to do it this way or blah, blah, blah. Where did you learn your thoughts and beliefs about marriage? Think about that, or gender or whatever. And then And then, maybe briefly mention the ways in which either these concepts and practices can be similar to your Tibetan society, or you could talk about like, well, maybe marriage is practiced differently, but there's a similarity in that functionalist and historical concerns influence the development of the way these things are practiced in both societies, right? So kind of bring it together. Show how, even though there are differences, there are also similarities, right? We're all humans. All humans have culture. And culture isn't really necessarily mysterious. There are reasons why it works the way it does. Okay, now that's the format. Then I offer some tips and notes. It's mostly about citing things in quotes. I would strongly recommend that you don't use quotes. I don't think you need quotes in this article. But if you do use quotes, if you think it's really necessary, you have to put them in quotation marks and you have to cite the source. Okay, so here's an example where I took part of a sentence from When Brothers Share a Wife. Okay, notice that I put it in quotation marks. Okay, and then at the end I give a citation. And the form of the citation is the last name of the author, the date of the publication, and the page on which your quote comes from. Okay? So any kind of citation in your text should have author and date. Okay? If you are quoting something, you also need to give the page. But if you're not quoting it, if you just got some information from somewhere and you're communicating to your audience that this is where this information comes from, you just need author and date. All right. So any information that you get from outside sources, you need to cite. Okay. You don't need to cite When Brothers Share a Wife for this paper, just because I'm assuming that you're using it. Okay, you only need to cite it if you're quoting it. Okay, but for everything else, if you are looking some stuff up somewhere about economics in Tibetan society or something, and you're using that information anywhere in your paper, you need to cite where you got that information. Okay, so here's an example of how you do that. Let's say you read somewhere that Tibetan men typically think of household chores in the kitchen as women's work, okay? Now, this is not a direct quote. This is just information that you got from some article, right? You still need to cite it. So in this case, there's two authors, Hillman and Henfrey, those are the last names, and then the date, 2006, okay? If you quote it, then you need to put a page. But if this is not a quote, if you just got some information from it and you're not closely paraphrasing or something, then you just need author and date. All right. If there's more than two authors, then you put the first author and then et al., which means and colleagues. It's a Latin abbreviation. Okay. So if it was me and two of my friends, or three of my friends, or four of my friends, or whatever, just say Toussaint et al. And then the date. All right. Avoid close paraphrasing. So if you're thinking, I'll get around quoting something by changing a couple of words, nope, that's going to show up as plagiarism, okay? And rightfully so. It is plagiarism because you're basically copying, except you're changing a couple of words. That means you're not doing your own thinking. If you're going to use information from some other source, just put it in your own words. Okay, you don't need to closely paraphrase something. So, yes, if you are using information from somewhere else and you put it in your own words, that's great. Just make sure you cite the source. Okay. Now, I also want you to know you don't have to use outside sources. That's not required. Right? If you choose your three anthropological concepts wisely, there's enough information in When Brothers Share a Wife that you can go with that, okay? Okay, let's see. Anything that you do cite in the text needs to be put in a works cited page at the end of your paper, okay? With the full bibliographic reference. So for the format of those references, you can use whatever standard you want. Just make sure you use a standard, either MLA, Chicago Manual of Style, American Anthropological Association, whatever. Just be consistent, okay? And one last thing is don't use dubious online sources, okay? Like Wikipedia, I love Wikipedia. I spend way too much time on Wikipedia. It's great. Don't quote Wikipedia. It's a great starting point, though, because everything that's stated in Wikipedia should have a reference at the end. So if there's some information, you'll notice there should be a little number by it that links to a reference at the end. Go to that reference and cite that reference, okay? Don't quote things from Wikipedia. Don't closely paraphrase things from Wikipedia. If you get information from Wikipedia, cite the source that it came from, okay? So that's about it. If you have questions on this, feel free to email me or tag me on our GroupMe chat. This is not meant to stress you out. This is just meant to give you guidelines to help you make it the best you can make it, okay? It's only 3 pages. I'm not trying to make this hard. I'm just trying to give you guidelines, okay? So, okay, good luck with that, and let me know if you have questions, okay? Take care.